Cool. Um, Hi, everybody. So the presentation is on the AI readiness and the digital divide of developing nations. So I know it's long and you're tired, so I will try and keep this as entertaining and intriguing as possible. So when we talk about, so largely the presentation today is going to speak about the digital divide, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, although we would focus on Africa in totality. What does that mean for the readiness of South Africa in particular? And then also South Africa versus other global players. And then where do we go from here? So when we talk about the digital divide and AI readiness, what does that mean? And without underestimating anybody's capabilities or intelligence here, but for even those who are online, when we talk about the digital divide, it's basically the gap for those who benefit from technology and technological advances versus those who do not. And this exists at two levels, A, within this country, and B, the country compared to other countries globally and internationally. So when we talk about the AI readiness of a country, it refers to how prepared a country is to use and adopt AI, but particularly a government being able to use and adopt AI in public sector and for public benefit. So AI-powered transformation means that a government of a country needs to have the tools and the operating infrastructure, as well as the technology to roll out what we call 4IR, or now developing and emerging technology for public and for the public benefit. In this report, the percentages and the technical references that I make are based on the Global AI Readiness Report, which are conducted over 160 countries. And you would see the link there. The presentation will also be made available to Namisa. So the Global AI Readiness Report actually looks at 10 sectors, which cover largely data and infrastructure, technology, and government readiness in the country. So here, to get some interest going, I decided to pick a few headlines based on recent news. And it should come as no surprise to anybody. If you look at these headlines, it says influence through global tech influence, reshaping power relations, shaping global standards. It's not surprise to anybody that predominantly AI strategies and AI influence are concentrated in global North countries, particularly the US and the EU. And this in itself demonstrates a deepening global divide, not only from a technological and infrastructure, but also from an AI readiness component point of view. And it becomes especially prevalent when we look at private sector and the fact that private sector concentration and big tech particularly come out of these countries. So if we look at these concepts and we look at global standards, who are these global standards made with? Were they made with global players? Were they made with Africa? Were we invited to the party? Or is it global standards, but for Africa, for Southeast Asia, for Latin America? And it also comes back to the issue of power games. And what does that mean? And I mean, I make a very quick reference here, but Facebook, or Meta as it's called now, with all of the components in it, Insta, WhatsApp, Facebook itself, they basically told the EU that if you do not change your regulatory framework and allow us to move data to process it and store it in the US, we're actually probably going to just pull out Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook from Europe because it's not sustainable to keep it there. So just let that percolate in your mind. A technology company told a whole continent to change and reconsider its regulatory framework. So as we move on and bring it closer to home, where are we in comparison with other people? Currently, the world average of AI readiness ranks at 47.42%. South Africa just makes the cut, slightly above, and we are ranked at 48.24% of in AI readiness. And that is obviously taking into account the earlier factors I meant of government, technology, and infrastructure. So we are positioned number 68 out of 160 countries globally. And then in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, we are ranked second out of the top 5. And if you know your football well, then you would know the flags there, or any sports really. The top 5 ranking countries are Mauritius, South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, by the way, Mauritius, South Africa, Kenya, our football nemesis Ghana, and then we have Cape Verde. So in this particular context, Mauritius, out of these top 5, remain the only country that have a developed national AI strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at Africa globally, continentally, then Egypt will be the second country that has a developed national AI strategy, and they launched that last year. Currently, Ghana and Rwanda are busy developing an AI strategy, and we know this because GIZ are helping them to do this. Kenya does not have an AI strategy, but what Kenya does have is an AI task force, and they're also leading the East African AI Forum to develop the East African AI strategy regionally. And we know this because GIZ are also involved. But if we look at South Africa, I think that we're not far behind. What we do have is the 4-hour Presidential Commission report, which is thought to be a prelude to a national AI strategy. But obviously the report is only going to carry us so much. That means that more work needs to be done insofar as actually getting a competent AI strategy that includes elements of blockchain and IoT. So if we move it along and bring it a little bit more closer to home and focus on South Africa alone, like I said, we don't have an AI strategy, but we have the report. But what South Africa has been doing that does deserve some credit to the DCDT is, in fact, they've been working together with Smart Africa in developing the African AI blueprint. So Smart Africa, a completely independent organization made up with a lot of the African leaders in African countries. And basically what they've done is they have a whole lot of member states, and South Africa had been championing this. And when I say they champion this, it means that President Cyril Ramaphosa himself had adopted this AI blueprint, signed it off, and presented it to the Smart Africa board. And this was now incorporated as Africa's AI strategy, or at least a blueprint of how national strategies should be designed. And what it does is it shows South Africa as positioning itself as a leader to almost move AI on the continent, but also to collaborate with other African players and seeing how we as Africa, not just South Africa, but how as we as Africa can make AI interoperable amongst us on the continent. There's also discussions around developing with the Smart Africa Secretariat, discussions around developing an AI regional center within Africa. It's no surprise that the main priority for sub-Saharan African countries is capacity development, and we've been discussing this significantly over the last 3 days of this summit. And the fact is that sub-Saharan African countries lack a lot of capacity development and local talent, not the capability, but the capacity development and the talent to be built to be able to bring it in line to make us a globally prevalent player. And I'll be a little bit controversial when I make this next statement, but the fact is that in the State of the Nation address about 2 weeks ago, our president did say that it's not the responsibility of government to create jobs. And the fact is that most people in employment currently are in private sector. That makes up like 80%. So where's private sector in all of this? Where's private sector now, actually? So the question is, what are we doing, and how does government and private sector work together to build South Africa and build its AI readiness? And more importantly, if private sector, as we've seen with technology companies, are such a big player, what is their role? What is their responsibility? So I bring it a little bit more closer to home in this context. The idea is that we want to move Africa away from being a consumer to a producer. And when I say that, I mean a consumer, from moving away from being a consumer of technology to a producer of African tech. And we know that private sector obviously leads this race in technology development because they have the money and they have the capability to do research and development. But in that context, and let's look at South Africa, how much is private sector or industry able to contribute to a strategy? Do they have, with their power, with their capabilities, with the ability to shape discussions, Do they have a say in how strategy gets developed? And also then, do they come in with priorities? Do they have their own priorities that may be different to what we in this room discuss, what academics feel, what the public feels? In the context of that, if they have all of this power, do they also have a responsibility to contribute? Because we know, and has been the discussion in the past few days, that building AI capacity also requires education and academics, but trying to develop and get a qualified, what is the word, academic curriculum, it takes time, a lot of time. And the fact of those delays and private sector development is just incongruent. It's not going to work. So where does private sector come in to actually bridge that gap? We in South Africa are quite privileged because we have a very developed private sector. Banking, automotive, mining, and telecoms. I mean, we are just really up there. But for AI development to work, we need private sector to come in and help us. And when I say us, I mean everybody needs to work together, whether it's government, industry, academia, civil society, development organizations. And so we want to drive, firstly, with capacity being developed in and through the private sector, fewer import of foreign talent. We want to develop the talent locally. We want to build a drive to have local capacity development, but we also want research and industry to come together. So we have local research solving local industry problems. We don't want industry and research to go off on a tangent in their own different directions. So how can this happen? There are two immediate thoughts, and I put this up, and it's definitely open for debate and challenge. Capacity development, we know, is important, but I think we must also think further than just skilling for jobs. You know, having a job is great, but it's not everything. We need to start skilling for tech entrepreneurship. So it's beyond just saying, skill them so they can work, skill them so they can be self-employed and sustainable. And the second point would be, if we have government moving with a structured agenda, we have South Africa moving with a structured agenda, we can increase AI readiness, because then we have proper and inclusive public consultation and co-creation of AI readiness and AI strategy. And that creates, and if government's willing to adopt AI at a faster and a more sustainable and efficient pace, it creates a drive for local services. And then local services means local capacity development and local solutions. So it's almost like a cycle to sustain and develop AI. But of course, we also want sustainable solutions, because sustainable solutions mean there's long-term commitment, and it means that there's long-term job creation. It develops new talent, and we have a forward-looking approach onto AI. It's not just skills for now. The last thing that I want on that point is to say that a local solution, and this is where it's very important for me particularly, local solutions means that we bring African ethics and African values into technology creation, because I think that's a big element of what's missing now in the fact that we consume technology that's not African developed. And so the technology can have African values solving African problems with African user data, because that for me is also a big component that's missing. I think right now we're almost kind of colonizing ourselves by the fact that we continually consume technology but don't create it, and then we're kind of giving away our raw data quite a bit for it to be sold back to us. But again, open to debate and challenge. I like to be controversial from time to time. Just a thought example on what Kenya is doing before I conclude. So Kenya has recognized that there is a skills gap problem. And the way that they've solved it is that they've looked at deciding to change their educational curriculum to have the curriculum more technology oriented. And so that means that they have they've adopted computer science and AI concepts through all the levels of the education curriculum. What this means though, is that it's really quite interesting, because you bring technological components, which is both academic, but also skills-based. So I believe like artisan level components, but academic components into the curriculum. It also means then you have a chance of new educators coming in, and you almost kind of close the generational knowledge gap. So you have youth that are actually taught and mentored and engaging with youthful educators, and there isn't a massive generational knowledge gap of someone trying to learn technology and then teaching to someone else. And the best part and the most important part for me is that when you have technology incorporated into the education system, you're building a gender balanced pipeline for the future, because we know right now that there's a massive gender imbalance in technology and particularly in the AI sector. So in closing, what does all of this have to do with ethics and governance? And so essentially we know that big tech and private sector, if they are left unregulated, it creates a lot of problems. And we've seen a proliferation of very bad and really poorly created technology, particularly algorithms that, even with unintended consequences, are racist, sexist, xenophobic, and it prejudices the poor and the marginalized society. And it's not acceptable. It really isn't. So there is a dire need for obviously technology and particularly AI to be regulated. But if everybody works together, we can find a way to get ethics and AI and technology aligned in an inclusive and representative governance platform and a governance framework, both so that there is algorithmic accountability, but that we also do not stifle innovation, because innovation is the key, and that's what we need for South Africa to move forward. So on that note, I say thank you.